Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we look at crisis in the age of AI and specifically the implications of generative AI for crisis and risk management. Before we get started, two quick notes on the housekeeping front. Firstly, this call is going to be recorded and it will be made available to everyone who is registered today. Secondly, we do hope to have time for some questions at the end of this session. So you should see a Q&A button on your screen. Please use that to submit questions, and we will get to as many of those as we have time for at the end of today's presentation. But we do have a lot to cover. So without further ado, my name is Dave Fleet. I am the head of our global digital crisis team at Edelman, and I am also a member of Edelman's Global AI Task Force. I joined Edelman in 2010, and my role nowadays focuses on ensuring the integration of digital considerations into our crisis and our risk work with companies, whether that be new types or evolutions of crises, new and evolved dynamics within crisis management, or new applications of digital strategies, tools, and techniques within crisis communications. And over the next hour, we're going to look at the field of generative AI through all of those lenses. So it goes without saying at this point that AI is the hot topic at the moment. We are seeing daily stories about the incredible innovation in this space and the opportunities it can bring for people, for businesses, for society, accelerated discoveries in healthcare, increases in productivity, maybe even accurate weather forecasts if we're lucky. And generative AI really is at the peak of inflated expectations on the Gartner hype cycle right now, and with very good reason. The opportunities really are very, very significant for us. But there is a dark side of AI, and there is one where these tools are used against us instead of for us. And I want to preface this entire presentation by saying that I and we at Edelman are not anti-AI in any way. In fact, we see huge opportunities for its use, both broadly and in crisis communications itself. And we will get to some opportunities within crisis a little later. But there is a tough reality that we have to grapple with, which is that regardless of whether or not we as individuals and as practitioners and professionals, or our organizations more broadly, whether or not we choose to use these tools, other people are using them. And not all of those people will have good intentions. And we need to think about the implications of this. So we're going to spend this session looking through 5 different types of threats and risks that we are looking for. Some of these are clear and present challenges for organizations now. Some of these are things that we are watching for signals for. We're going to talk through disinformation and misinformation. We'll talk through digital media manipulation. We'll look at cybersecurity. We'll look at copyright and ownership issues, and we will look at a bucket at the end that we call emergent crises. And we're going to get to each of these in turn. So threat number 1. This is an area in which I spend a lot of my own time personally as I oversee Edelman's work supporting clients in addressing mis and disinformation threats. And I want to start with a story. So earlier this year, researchers at a network analysis company called Graphica were studying the activities of a long-standing pro-China political spam operation that they termed spamouflage. And they noticed something that stood out as they were doing their research. They saw 2 videos showing what appeared to be English-speaking news anchors under the banner of Wolf News. In one video, a male anchor talked about what he saw as the United States' shameful lack of action against gun violence. In another one, a female anchor heralded China's role in geopolitical relations at a recent international summit. But those researchers noticed that something wasn't quite right. The faces weren't quite syncing with the language. They were a little bit pixely. The movements of the mouths didn't quite sync. The hair of this person in particular was a little too static. And there were numerous grammatical errors that they saw in the captions around these videos. And so at first, these researchers thought that these were paid actors narrating fake news reports. But what it turned out was that this was the first known example of state-aligned actors experimenting with using generative AI to create deepfakes as part of an influence operation. And this is our first major issue here. Disinformation is probably one of the most, if not the most, feared and certainly is the most discussed threat from this current generation of AI tools. As these tools are evolving, videos like this can now be created in minutes for just a few dollars and with off-the-shelf software. So to dive into this a little bit further and to illustrate what we're talking about here, I have a guest speaker for our next slide.
Generative AI is poised to cause a significant shift in the disinformation threat landscape. These tools have the potential to transform the three key elements of disinformation: actors, behaviors, and content. Firstly, the widespread availability of generative AI technology will make more sophisticated activities accessible and feasible, potentially leading to an increase in the number of bad actors operating in this domain. Secondly, generative AI will enable actors to produce deceptive content at scale, dramatically increasing the volume of misleading online material while keeping production costs low. As a result, the internet may become saturated with fake content, making it increasingly difficult for individuals to differentiate between fact and fiction. Lastly, generative AI's capacity to create content can help overcome one of the primary challenges faced by foreign state actors: producing content that is culturally and grammatically convincing. As this technology becomes more readily available, we can expect these obstacles to be rapidly surmounted. At the same time, the quality of output will continue to increase, including the use of digital people that will increasingly look and sound real.
And in case you couldn't tell from Ms. Uncanny Valley here, this was a deepfake video. It took me about 5 to 10 minutes to write the script. It took maybe 10 to 15 minutes to produce the video, and it cost just a few dollars. And I used the same tool that was used for the videos in the last example that I gave. And it's important to remember that while that video, did feel a little uncomfortable and the syncing was slightly off, as one of my colleagues likes to say, this is the worst version of this technology that we're ever going to use. And it is advancing at an exponential rate, and the quality of these kinds of pieces of content is going to continue to increase over time. So as we just said on the last slide, generative AI really lowers the barriers to entry across three key aspects of how you can look at misinformation, disinformation: actors, behaviors, and content. And it can manifest in a number of ways. We just talked about hyper-realistic fake media, and that doesn't just mean deepfake videos, but also fake voice and images as well. We see automation of propaganda and troll farms and the like. Bot farms increasing the scale of content or the reach of content at speed. For example, the social intelligence company Cyabra estimated that more than 25% of conversations around the Israel-Hamas war were inauthentic, and at times that number spiked even higher. The picture on the second from the left here is a screen cap from a piece about a platform called CounterCloud. And this was an experiment. It was a fully automated system that monitored the internet for relevant articles on certain topics, created counter articles to the points made by those articles, created images for those counterpoints and the articles that it drafted, and then tweeted those out. It ran behind closed doors for just a few days. It created more than 200 pieces of content, and the estimated cost of running that for a full month was less than $400 a month. Now, this was created as a force for good. This was created to try to counter some negative and nefarious narratives, but was quickly pointed out that it would be very easy to turn that on its head and use that as an automated engine for less positive purposes. Third example here is the mass production of content at quality. For example, a recent investigation in France uncovered a disinformation campaign that was impersonating mainstream media. In the past, many influence operations like this struggled with grammatical and cultural nuances, proper use of words, especially in a kind of Western cultural context. But AI chatbots can solve for this. And we've seen reports recently in the last 24 to 48 hours around generative AI being used to fuel these kinds of campaigns. And then lastly, we have personalized disinformation and impersonation, which is also a cyber threat that we'll get to a little bit later. But the ability to round up enough convincing information about someone to fake them doing or saying something, or to spoof someone that a target individual knows becomes quite possible. So a close cousin to mis and disinformation is the broader manipulation of media at scale. And generally for each of these sections, we're going to try and close off each one with a set of implications and thoughts on what we can do about some of these threats. These two areas are so close together that we're actually just going to bring them together, and we'll have a common set of recommendations at the end. But I want to give you another story to illustrate what we're talking about here. because generative AI's impact on social media and the digital ecosystem extends beyond just deepfakes and disinformation and misinformation. So to illustrate that, this summer, the New York Times ran a report on a flood of travel guides that were hitting Amazon. They looked good, they had seemingly credible authors, but they were all generated by AI, and it showed. The descriptions within the books were fairly generic. They lacked the basic elements of what people look for in guidebooks, things like itineraries or tailored itineraries for different levels of trip and the like. People were buying them because they were cheaper than brand name guidebooks, but those people were starting to leave negative reviews. But now we're also dealing with a flood of AI-generated product reviews as well. So this problem just keeps increasing. And this is an example at the early end of what we're expecting here. As these, as the manipulation of generated content and the sophistication of AI-generated content continues to increase, we're likely to see a growing problem here. Beyond AI-generated books, which is one example, people are already flooding the internet with AI-generated content in places that are famous for this, whether that be in user reviews or on platforms like X, formerly Twitter. Generative AI can also be employed to create more convincing automated accounts and bots to generate large volumes of tailored content that can rapidly spread on social media platforms. Another risk is the generation of hyper-targeted content that's designed to elicit certain reactions, to exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and to produce targeted content that's trying to generate a certain behavior. So, for example, we see fringe groups and influencers looking to galvanize outrage on certain issues, and this could be a potent tool for them. Researchers have already demonstrated the potential for people to manipulate search results. In one instance, a person placed hidden text on a web page about themselves that described themselves as a time traveler. A popular chatbot then used that result and used that phrase when asked who he was. Meanwhile, we're starting to see reports of AI-generated images cropping up in search results for individuals, which then represents a potential reputational threat, whether that's for individuals or for organizations. The ability for AI to enable all of these things, greater volumes of content, more believable manipulated content, the ability to get that content more visible in the ways that people are actually seeking for and obtaining their information, raises then for organizations the risk of high impact issues and risks like advocacy campaigns, boycotts, online backlash around contentious issues, and the like. So what can we do to address these risks? Firstly, as communicators, our ability to operate effectively is predicated on being grounded in the reality of a situation. Without that, we can't be sure if we're doing the right thing to solve a problem, or even if we're actually addressing the right problem. And with this cluttered landscape, it's getting harder and harder to know what's going on. And to make sure, because of that, that we're responding to the right signals. So job one here is to raise literacy within our organizations, not just around AI, but around digital and media more broadly, especially within communications teams that are in the day-to-day on this, but also with executive teams that may be less familiar with the dynamics in play here and with the implications of what it may mean for what they are seeing and believing. Secondly, we need to look at our risk resilience measures and to make sure that they are fit for purpose in this environment. Taking a look at our reputational risks and vulnerabilities in this area, examining readiness against those. Do your crisis plans hold up against these kinds of threats? Do they need updating? Some organizations are opting for standalone disinformation response plans, for example. And then ensure that we're building muscle memory around how to respond to these threats through training and simulations in these areas. Thirdly, we need to establish warning systems. For some organizations, traditional social media monitoring is going to be just fine. But note that for more acute threats, these platforms can sometimes fall short on a number of fronts. Firstly, the range of platforms that they cover, especially when we're dealing with more acute threats to certain industries, where you're finding yourselves grappling with fringe groups or state-aligned disinformation. And secondly, these platforms are typically focused primarily on volume and on sentiment. Unfortunately, the psychology of disinformation and the dynamics around it are such that by the time something breaks through and creates a spike in volume or a drop in sentiment towards the brand, you're already behind the game. It's much harder to disabuse someone of a notion than it is to try to get ahead of it and to build knowledge and understanding of the truth with them ahead of time. And so research is showing that the key is to build resiliency in advance or to catch things early and inoculate audiences. And there are platforms that, for those with that fear more acute threats of misinformation and disinformation in particular, can help specifically with that, with catching things early. And then lastly, we need to build the organizational capacity to move quickly in the case of an issue. And that goes across identification, escalation, how do we verify claims against us, and how do we communicate quickly? And we need to think both internally and externally about that readiness. Third area here is increased cybersecurity threats. And another story here. Back in early 2020, a branch manager of a Japanese company who was based in Hong Kong received a call from a man whose voice he recognized. It was the director of his parent business. This director shared some good news. The company was about to make an acquisition, and he needed to authorize some transfers to the tune of $35 million. A lawyer had been hired to coordinate this acquisition. The branch manager had received emails from this lawyer. He'd received emails from this director, and they confirmed what money needed to move where. And so the manager, believing that everything was legitimate, began making these transfers. But what he didn't know was that that phone call wasn't real. Those emails weren't real. And he was part of an elaborate scheme that used deep voice technology to clone the director's speech. And we know this from court filings that were reported on by Forbes, in which the UAE sought American investigators' help in tracing $400,000 of those stolen funds that had landed in a US bank. And so that's an example that brings us into our third area of risk here, which is that of cybersecurity. And generative AI technologies present a variety of new cybersecurity challenges. 86%, that's the number of cyber professionals in a recent study who experienced an increase in attacks over the last year and believed it was due to bad actors using generative AI. A significant risk here is the use of Gen AI to enhance social engineering attacks, the most obvious of which is AI-generated phishing emails and messages that closely mimic the writing style of trusted contacts, which make it harder to recognize the deception that's in place here, and also then the impersonation of executives. Through these tools, highly convincing personalized content can be weaponized to manipulate people, whether that is into revealing sensitive information that gives bad actors access to corporate systems, installing malicious software, or taking some other form of action like we just discussed. From January to February this year, cybersecurity firm Darktrace actually reported a 135% increase in what they call novel social engineering attacks across their customers, just to illustrate the scale of the threat here. And the secondary effect of this is not just in effectiveness. IBM recently released a report showing that when they were doing phishing simulations and creating them through their cybersecurity task force or their business, they were able to cut down the amount of time required to create a phishing simulation from 16 hours of work to an hour of work using these tools. So just thinking about the efficiency that this is driving. Additionally, we have the risk here of Gen AI being employed to automate the discovery and the exploitation of security vulnerabilities. AI systems being generated on and trained on historical data around known vulnerabilities or attack patterns, and then rapidly identifying weaknesses in software and systems that outpaces traditional cybersecurity defenses. Now, this isn't all bad news, and many have suggested that Gen AI may actually be a solution to these threats. I attended a cybersecurity summit held by the Aspen Institute recently, and they had mixed opinions on this around whether ultimately the attackers or the defenders will prevail here. But right now, the defenders are on the back foot somewhat, and the attackers are the ones who have the opportunities to innovate at the outset. So what does this mean for us? Well, unlike in the misinformation and disinformation and in the media manipulation areas here, really the primary implications of this for organizations are technical rather than reputational. The likelihood and the impact of attacks both increase. And so, in a traditional threat matrix where we look at those two things, likelihood and impact, this moves up and to the right. But there are some implications here for crisis and for communicators. Firstly, companies need to make sure that they're establishing an AI usage policy governing the use of that Gen AI within the organization, to avoid people unintentionally installing or adopting malicious tools, because we have started to see some of the things like browser extensions and the like incorporating malicious technologies. With the likelihood of attacks increasing, coordination between the IT and the comms teams is ever more important for a unified response strategy. Now, that's table stakes for a lot of organizations that are ready in this space and spend time thinking about cyber responses. But it's not for every organization, and it's becoming increasingly important. And then lastly, we are entering a time here where cyber attacks may become more newsworthy again. A few years ago, a major attack would create days or weeks of news. Nowadays, we feel like we're bombarded with them all the time. And the ones that we hear about the most are the ones that are exceptional, whether it is in scale or because of mistakes that have been made in the response, whether they be technical, regulatory, or communications. But we're in a new environment now. We're in a new environment in terms of disclosures, certainly in some markets and jurisdictions, for example, the new SEC rules in the US. But we're also now dealing with novelty in attacks. And AI is a hot topic right now. So new and hot topic makes things interesting. Interesting makes them newsworthy. Newsworthy means we might see more attention on these kinds of attacks as they start to emerge. And so we're likely to see this happening. And this is going to lead to us having to thread the needle with complex narratives that are grappling with this because you're going to get attention on the means of these attacks. That means that your communications team needs to be technically savvy, and we need to understand some of the dynamics in place here. Fourth area of risk, and that includes these of copyright and ownership and responsibility for content. Right now, there is ambiguity and a number of high-profile lawsuits in determining the rightful ownership of AI-generated content. As these new Gen AI models are creating content with minimal human intervention, there are questions that are being raised over whether the AI itself or its creator or the end user should be granted the copyright. In the US, we've now had a federal court ruling that found that works created only using AI were not eligible for copyright protection. But that's not necessarily the end state, nor is it a global picture. In fact, just in the last few days in China, we saw a ruling in the other direction. Meanwhile, the media industry itself is locked in a battle with a number of platforms around the use of its content in training these models. Authors are suing platforms, content generators and celebrities are suing platforms, and this is sure to be a volatile space, and we don't know where it's going to land yet. Now, without this clarity, organizations using AI-generated content may be inadvertently infringing on IP rights or face disputes over the ownership of content, which could lead to legal damage and reputational damage. So we are seeing now platforms starting to roll out enterprise-grade plans that indemnify users from risks in this area. So we have two implications here for communicators. Firstly, we need to make sure that we're establishing robust governance for the use of AI within an organization. How are you planning to coordinate the use of AI within the business? How will you vet new tools? Will that be centralized or will it be decentralized? What do you expect of employees in terms of how they use their tools and their conduct using them? How will you make sure that people are trained for them? So all of those things become really, really important in this kind of landscape. And we also need to look at adopting these enterprise-grade tools, which are increasingly now offering things like indemnification against copyright claims from these third parties. Lastly, we have a fifth bucket here of emergent issues. And to illustrate the challenge here, you may have read, in fact, it's fairly hard to miss, the angst that many higher ed institutions and education as a sector in general have been feeling around the use of generative AI by students, the risk of them doing their assignments or their homework or their essays using these tools. And so it's only natural that the platforms that educators have been turning to in general to try and root out things like plagiarism in the past would seek to try to address this problem. And a number of these platforms introduce generative AI text detectors. But there's a twist. Different people use language differently. For example, people who speak English as a second language tend to use simpler sentence structure, and they tend to use less complex language. Unfortunately for them, those are some of the markers that are being used by these platforms to detect AI-generated content in their papers. The first reports of this we saw emerging earlier in the spring, around April. And then there's another report that came out in August showing that 7 top platforms, those platforms flagged text from non-English, English as a first language speakers 61% of the time, versus just 5% of English speakers. So this is an example here of an emergent issue, one that's unpredicted, but that is emerging as a risk due to specific use of a platform or a tool. And as these systems get more sophisticated, there is a risk that these unintended consequences may continue to arise from the AI's actions or recommendations. And these could lead to financial, technological, or even geopolitical crises that could require crisis communicators to address them. One key concern here is that Gen AI may just produce unexpected behaviors in autonomous systems. When ChatGPT was first created, no one expected it to be able to code. That was an emergent behavior. What we're thinking about here is other types of emergent behaviors that we may not be expecting. These models are becoming more complex, and they remain relatively opaque. There's a lot of research being done into that right now to try and to really pry apart what is going on within these tools. But right now, it's not entirely clear all the time. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand and control the decision-making processes here. Consequently, these autonomous systems in particular might produce actions that deviate from what we expect, and leading to things like accidents or ethical violations or other adverse reputational consequences. And as these systems get more complex, we're also likely to see more of them interacting with each other in a more automated way. So then you have layered challenges of unpredictable interactions. Another risk that's been well discussed is the risk of and the potential for AI-driven automation to exacerbate biases in the systems that are caused by biased training data or other issues. And the potential to create content that is offensive or defamatory or otherwise harmful. For example, autonomous hiring systems discriminating against certain demographic groups or perpetuating wage gaps and the like. These kinds of issues can have far-reaching societal impacts and undermine public trust in these kinds of systems, but they also present acute reputational issues for the companies that are involved, such as those in the educational example we discussed earlier. So this area is a really hard one for us to plan for, specifically as we're by definition talking about emergent issues that we may not anticipate. In some areas like that of bias, some of the responsibility needs to lie with the tool developers and the platforms themselves, but the reputational risk, as we all know, may still fall onto us within our companies if we're the ones using these tools. So firstly, we need to raise the awareness of these kinds of issues amongst the workforces that are using the tools, and to train people to be conscious and on the lookout for these types of issues. With the unpredictable nature of these, though, we also need to make sure that we are ready for things that we don't expect, and that our communications crisis plans account for this. And we can't just limit our level of preparedness to purely scenario plans around our highest risk areas. Certainly do have those, but organizations also need to make sure that that the crisis plans provide clarity around decision making and structures to enable rapid movement in an unexpected situation. And then, as with the disinformation advice earlier, we also need to then evolve the kinds of situations that we are training for and simulating with our teams. This sounds really basic, especially to those of you who are crisis communicators, I'm sure, but many companies are still bereft of this kind of planning, this kind of flexibility. One last point here on the risks and the threats. As we look across the cumulative impact of all of these risks, the challenge for us and the risk is that these things together start to create the potential for a pretty profound effect, one that risks eroding trust in our information landscape in general. And the risk of a zero trust landscape emerges, one where people are just inherently skeptical of everything that they read or see or hear. And I think to an extent, certainly with some parts of our populations, we're already on a potential path towards some of that, even without the impact of generative AI. But in a zero trust landscape, people may actually just struggle to really discern the authenticity of news, images, videos, even personal communications, and that could have really far-reaching consequences. whether that is undermining the credibility of legitimate information sources, making it very challenging for us to think about who are the right groups to turn to communicate really important points that have been trusted in the past but may no longer be. And how do we make sure that the flow of accurate, reliable information to the people who need to know it remains uninterrupted? And this could have broader societal impacts on various aspects of life. And this is a broader societal level problem. And ultimately, it may require a societal level intervention. But there is a piece around this where I think we can have an impact. And we talked about it in the first couple of areas, which is one of promoting digital literacy so that people can better evaluate what they're seeing, what they're understand the potential pitfalls of some of these technologies on what they're consuming. This has been done to good effect at a societal level in places like Finland, which has a world-class media literacy program that starts from kindergarten age all the way up through the education system. But that's something we can also take on within our own spheres of influence in jurisdictions where we don't have those kinds of curriculums. Additionally, as we start to see nowadays more movement on things like authentication and content verification systems, things like digital watermarking and content provenance tracking, we've seen this on its own is likely insufficient, but it's been really good to see movement on this, both from the US federal government recently, as well as from groups like the Content Authenticity Initiative, to which Edelman is actually a signatory. Lastly, fostering a culture of transparency and accountability in AI development and deployment can help to hopefully to restore and maintain some trust in our ecosystem. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the threats. I want to switch gears somewhat. I'm going to wrap up initially with some ways to get started. And then I want to talk a little bit about the other side here and some opportunities for us, because while we have focused on the black cloud and the threats, it's not a one-sided story, and I don't want to give that kind of impression. So firstly, though, how do we build resilience around these risks? So step one, map your risks. Look at where you think your risks and gaps may be. Look at their overlap with other issues that you're facing at the moment. Look at your relative readiness in those areas. Revise your crisis plans. Make sure they are fit for purpose. Revise your scenario plans. Revise your training. Make sure that they are right for the current context and the current threats that are emerging now. Establish governance around AI. And if you haven't already, both at the level of how are we going to approach this for the enterprise, but also at the level of employee expectations and how you're going to train them. And then, and really only then, are you ready to start exploring the really exciting possibilities for using AI within the enterprise. And on that note, I want to finish off here by just giving 3 examples of different levels of engagement that companies can think about to start to leverage AI within crisis communications activities. Again, none of these are appropriate for all cases, and all of the caveats that we've mentioned throughout here apply. But this is to give you a bit of a sense of how we're thinking about some of the applications. Firstly, we have just off-the-shelf tools and looking at how those might be used. Now, care needs to be taken, extreme care needs to be taken, especially in crisis, with things like confidential information, especially if you aren't using an enterprise-grade tool. But there are some useful applications here, whether that be analyzing data on publicly available coverage on a topic, solving for the blank page problem, editing content, or pressure testing your thinking. I'll often use these tools for the latter. Ask it about a problem that I'm noodling on and compare it to what I'm thinking. And typically, 60–70% of that content might be something that I've already thought of. And maybe 20% of that is just not relevant. But then maybe there's 1 or 2 ideas that I haven't thought of. And that helps to augment the thinking by pressure testing where my head is at. A more mid-tier approach is to build more tailored tools using commercially available platforms. For example, we're working on prototyping and piloting tools to use AI to simulate audience reactions to situations and content, pulling in data from sources to build virtual personas, focus groups and the like, which would then allow us to pressure test risk assessments, create more dynamic crisis simulations. The list goes on. Again, these are very much in the pilot stage here, but this is an interesting area for exploration. And lastly, we have a more fully customized approach, such as our Edelman Trust Stream platform, which we're currently in the process of rolling out broadly. This is built in-house, It pairs our huge bank of proprietary data on trust with our ability to ingest millions of signals daily, to really get to an atomic level, looking at the impact of a piece of content on trust for an organization, whether that's at an article level or a journalist level or an individual piece of content level. We built TrustStream because today's crises are happening in a complex world, and that complexity isn't always captured in traditional tools, which are often very broad, blunt force objects. The level of detail that we can get here then unlocks the potential of more nuanced and powerful ways for us to predict future outcomes of issues. We can start to look at mitigating issues and crises at the outset based on what we expect impact to be, rather than allowing them to fester and then looking back in hindsight and wondering why we didn't move faster. We're also working on the ability to run simulations to then test how different language might change the course of a situation. This has been in development, to be very clear, for a very long time using broader types of AI. The advent of large language models and generative AI really, though, allow us to get to the powerful insights from that data more efficiently and to link from insight to action with more precision and predict outcomes. So this is really exciting for us. So hopefully this has been an interesting walkthrough of both the challenges and the threats that we're seeing, as well as some of the opportunities here. I will leave you with a little haiku, which I will tell you has probably been the most contentious aspect of this entire presentation, as I've gotten a lot of feedback about the quality of my haikus here. But with that little last aside, I am happy to open the floor for questions, and I believe we have about 20 minutes or so available.
Thanks, Dave, so much. And I just wanted to start with, for those who may have joined late, we will be sharing a recording of his presentation if you had to jump off or perhaps wanted to share with some of your other team members. But we did get a number of questions in, so I'm hoping we can get to most of them given the time we have left. So Dave, kind of want to kick off with, if you can maybe chat a bit the disinformation landscape, and specifically, how many of these threats are really a concern now versus hypothetical that we might see more down the line?
It's a great question. And as I think I said at the beginning, some of these are current threats. Some of these are things that we're watching for signals on. I don't think this is black and white. Like these signals are telling us that something is becoming real or is escalating versus just saying, yes, it is, or no, it isn't. In some of these areas, we are seeing those signals, and we're seeing them very loud, and we're seeing them with increased frequency. So, for example, in the case of cyber, there are studies, and we talked about some of those studies, and they're specifically citing generative AI as a cause. So I think that's a very clear area. I think another signal in that area is recognizing that the use of Gen AI to create some of the kinds of attacks that we're seeing from a cyber perspective, like that's not always clear, but we can look at the volume of requests and the nature of those, or the volume of the attacks and the nature of those attacks. So that's one area. We're also seeing those signals in the areas of disinformation and media manipulation. Foreign Policy magazine just had a piece out this week about the threat of disinformation against companies. Typically, when people hear the term disinformation, they think about big state actors going at other big state actors, but there really is a broader challenge here. And we saw actually at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war that there were alerts issued by the US government around, particularly around disinformation threats towards critical infrastructure areas within the US society. But more broadly, back to what we're seeing now, just in the last few days, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue put out a report around influence operations that they'd found using ChatGPT, and they found some key tells related to that. We've seen AI-generated images used by activists to pressure companies around the Israel-Hamas war. So challenges around those areas are very real. I would say challenges around bias are also very real. In other areas, some of these threats are a little more hypothetical. I say impact on search is an emerging area, and we've seen some examples around things like hallucinations. We had one client where one of the tools had actually decided that they'd been acquired by another company, which was not true. So we've seen things like that, but I wouldn't say it's like mainstream and mass in volume yet. The legal debates around copyright are certainly very real. But again, we don't know its eventual impact on companies yet. So, and then emerging threats are just by definition are unexpected. So I think there's a spectrum here, but some of these are very real and very concrete now. And then Alison, I don't know if there was more detail on the question around disinformation. I'm happy to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely some questions around sort of the difference between misinformation and disinformation. We also received some specific questions around, are we seeing a number of maybe private bad actors versus like state-sponsored disinformation? And also, maybe you can talk a bit about emerging sort of like trust in terms of the news landscape, specifically like deepfake articles and fake news, and thoughts around maybe how the trust stream might apply to sort of like determining those bad actors in that space.
Right, that's a lot of questions there. So starting on kind of difference between misinformation and disinformation. So within the field, if you will, of counter disinformation, there's an acronym called MDM, and so there's three kind of types of dynamic, if you will, or threat challenge that clients and companies face. So you have misinformation. Misinformation is information that's false, but is being spread in a genuine way, meaning the person doesn't necessarily know that they are spreading it. It's not necessarily done maliciously, the person believes it. Disinformation is still false, but it is being weaponized and kind of used directionally at an organization to cause some form of harm. That might be reputational, it might be financial. So we see that as an example here. A real concern for a lot of companies is, what if a short seller decides to deepfake our CEO and then put out some kind of content related to financial earnings results or the like. That's a really common concern that we hear from organizations. And then the third type is malinformation. Malinformation is information that may be true at the core, but is being used or misrepresented out of context. And used for harm in that way. So that's MDM. All of those things, the line isn't always clear. Those like challenges can migrate from deliberately sown threats into people who genuinely believe them. The other close cousin to this that we need to very deliberately avoid lumping in the same bucket is news we don't like, or inconvenient truths. And we need to make sure that we're very clear on the difference between those. And there is sometimes an unfortunate tendency to say that things are not true when they are just not convenient. And we need to be very clear on the differences there. One of the questions was around private versus state actors. The high profile challenges are certainly the ones that we see in the news that are often state-based. I would say that the mass volume of challenges that companies are facing are actually tend to be more on the misinformation side, sometimes disinformation, so by potentially activists, and I want to come back to the term activists in a moment. But I think the problem of misinformation in the landscape and of people believing things that aren't necessarily true, that aren't necessarily seeded by foreign states, is actually a much broader threat that companies are facing. Now, quickly on the term activists, I want to make sure I don't give the impression that activists are bad. Activists are typically a force for good. They pressure companies to doing the right thing. We wouldn't have the society we have today without activist groups. So I want to make sure that I don't give that impression. But there are groups that are activists for purposes that may be less values aligned with society and are doing it with a different intent. I think I covered most of it. There was one other piece, I think, though, Alison. Was that around news?
Yeah, so I think specifically, one of the examples that was mentioned, which is really interesting, is that now most users can tell that a deep fake New York Times article, for example, is fake by looking at the URL. And thinking about generative AI in the sense of how it can sort of seem like a human writer, eventually, do you foresee AI owning the URL and sort of that being another layer of a challenge for the end user to identify?
Yeah, and look, I think we're also a relatively sophisticated audience, I imagine here, and I try to say that without ego, but like we are thinking about these things a lot of the time. A lot of people aren't. And so I think, you know, we as communicators know for some of the signs to watch for, but many people don't. And we've got to remember that. I will say, you know, a lot of the times we're seeing these reports around, certainly around some of the emerging state actor activity, and the reports are appended with, you know, hey, this, you know, this wasn't necessarily, you know, didn't reach a lot of people. But then we also saw instances, and I can think of a very concrete example recently around inauthentic conversation, meaning like fake bots, fake accounts, spreading boycotts, calls for boycotts against organizations. And some of the accounts that we saw there related to that had hundreds of thousands or even millions of followers. Now, again, question mark around the authenticity of those followers, but those, you know, these aren't necessarily just small matters. As to the ownership of the URL, like you can be right, often those may be, but there's also, you know, very possible, and you know, for a long time people have looked at like your domain portfolio. Maybe you have a certain, you know, .com URL domain, but maybe .net's available or .ai is available or any of those others. So it's very possible that they get in closer. And I think one of the other challenges that we see in this space is that there have often been tells, right? You look at a piece of content, you're like, it doesn't feel right. The language is slightly off, or the word choice is just weird, and you start to question it. Again, if you're thinking about things in this way. The challenge that we're now facing is that these tools are producing content that is very believable. And again, we are using the worst version of these tools right now. They are just going to keep getting better. So we have to think about these threats not as static, what are we facing today, but we're on a exponential curve of development on this. And so what do they look like tomorrow, and how are we ready for that? Not in a like, oh no, the sky is going to fall on us, but how do we make sure that we are doing our due diligence? How do we make sure that we are ready if these things manifest? Because I know, I'll say for some of the companies that we're talking to, in their minds, it's not a question of if this hits them, but when.
I think that's a really good point that maybe we can pivot a bit. You mentioned in the presentation monitoring tools for early detection. And so maybe you can share some specific tools that you might recommend or platforms that we're currently looking at for early response detection.
Yeah, certainly. So there are a variety, right? And again, like platforms that we all use all the time as communicators are often fit for purpose for many companies. And the Talkwalkers or the Meltwater and the like. Those are for many organizations, those that don't necessarily face elevated threats. They're not in a critical industry. They're not in contentious spaces. They're not facing controversy. Those are often fine. There are some other types of tools that we look at. One is monitoring around fringe platforms, so the types that don't necessarily pop up in traditional monitoring. The Truth Social, Gab, those kinds of platforms that are less kind of monitoring friendly, if you will. There's one platform that we use called Pyra. Actually, I believe it's pronounced Pira, but we've used them. Another thing for us to recognize is that a lot of misinformation in particular circulates on mainstream platforms that just aren't as conducive to monitoring. Like for years, we've operated under this idea that if it's happening on Twitter, that's going to be good enough for us. But now there are, the amount of people who are primarily spending their time on platforms like Instagram or TikTok, not on Twitter, is quite significant. And so there are other platforms now that those platforms are less easy to monitor, harder to monitor. There are some tools that will help with that. But then for the more acute threats, there are other platforms that use AI themselves, and they will look at things like narratives that are emerging, clusters of conversations around certain clusters of accounts, and will help to visualize that so you can see things as they're emerging. There are platforms like I mentioned Cyabra earlier, Logically is another one of those, FindSight's another one of those. So there's a number of these platforms that are there for those companies that are facing more acute threats that feel like this enhanced monitoring is worthwhile.
So I think aside from monitoring and sort of content optimization, how might an organization tackle disinformation, misinformation head on? So further, is it strictly an online battle, or do credible third-party experts become part of the solution?
Great question. And we do need to think about this in a slightly different way to traditional crisis communications. One of the things I often say is, there are some the dynamics, the psychology, the dynamics within disinformation and misinformation leads to the need for different kinds of responses, and in some ways, it can break a crisis communicator's brain a little bit because it forces us to potentially unlearn some things that have been drilled in really hard into our heads for a long time. So one of the challenges, and I touched on this in the presentation, was the idea that it is, once someone has an idea in their head, it's very hard to shift them from that idea. And especially in a disinformation world where someone is deliberately crafting a narrative that hooks into a preconceived notion or a preconceived bias, that's really hard. It's much easier to introduce someone to the truth before they've been introduced to the lie. And so then that leads us to two ways of communicating that help us to get ahead of this. One way is just identifying our vulnerabilities ahead of time and building trust in the organization in those areas before the threats manifest. So being proactive, like truly proactive around reputation building in some of those areas. And to the point of the question, our research in trust has shown that certain types of spokespeople are more trusted, and experts continue to be very highly trusted. In certain areas, friends, family are very highly trusted. So how do we make sure that people see themselves in those spokespeople and those sources? Often the organization itself, especially when you're facing mis and disinformation, is not the credible source. So how do you partner with third parties to communicate that have that credibility? The second piece of that is one step closer to the threat, which is the idea of preemptive debunking, so it's known more as pre-bunking. And so there is now research, and a guy named Sander van der Linden has an excellent book called Foolproof that talks a lot about this. But the idea that you can inoculate people to an extent around misinformation or negative, false information by telling them that they are about to be manipulated, sharing what the truth is. It's kind of a bit of a sandwich approach. Again, that's the piece that breaks crisis communicators' brains, because we've been trained for years not to repeat the negative, and so now we're going out and saying, well, if we microdose people with this misinformation ahead of time, that they will be more resilient to it down the road. And so that one's a difficult one. A lot of organizations are very deeply uncomfortable with that idea. But research is showing that is far more effective than the last of our kind of recourses, which is debunking the narrative once it has already started. And that often is required, but there are challenges with it, because the unfortunate reality for us is that disinformation, misinformation tends to be kind of interesting. It can be exciting. It can be startling and newsworthy. It can be alarmist, because it's not constrained by the truth. And unfortunately for us, the truth is usually pretty dull, and it's usually pretty boring. And for that reason, there's research out there that says, false news, fake news travels 6 times as fast as the truth. And it travels further, it travels faster. And when you're playing catch up, that is all you're ever doing, you're playing catch up. And the reality is that even if you look at the timescales, the debunk never catches up to the falsehood. And so really that fact checking, while important, don't get me wrong, it's not that we shouldn't be doing it. It is typically insufficient to counter, especially narratives that have gained traction. And we saw that with the pandemic. And we've seen that in a number of places, that misinformation just takes hold. And even if it's almost laughable in its content, it can have a real significant impact.
So sort of pivoting a little bit to, the continuous evolution of AI, if a company or corporation decides to allow their employees to use AI in the workplace, how can it ensure that it operates ethically and does not, sort of force a security breach?
Right. I think that's where the governance and training piece comes in. So, if we think about Edelman ourselves, one of the first things that we did here was firstly establish a group to help with that kind of centralized vetting of tools. So, and governance around that. So how are you going to vet tools? Like, what's the process you're going to go through? How do you need to make sure that the right parts of the business are involved? It's not just an end user audience. You need to make sure that IT is looking at it. You need to make sure that legal and compliance are looking at it. So like there's that piece of like, okay, let's look at the tools that we're going to enable and endorse within the organization. And then a really important piece of it is, the code of conduct. Most organizations will have some kind of code of conduct for their employees. And so what does that look like? What's the code of conduct around AI look like? So for example, we have important principles in our code of conduct for employees around transparency if and when we're using tools. And making sure that our clients are aware that we're not doing it quietly on the side. We have a really, really important principle around the idea of human in the loop. Everything that comes out of an AI tool has to have human eyes on it. Nothing can ever just be sent off. So it's used to augment expertise, not replace. So I think those pieces are really important. And then the training that sits on top of that, because something's in a document doesn't mean it's actually going to be followed. So we have, our global training for our own employees is several hours long, and it includes a series of modules that are around the important implications and the risks of AI. And by understanding those risks, we know that then people can start to use the tools for their full potential without incurring risk for us.
So I know we're getting close to time, and maybe we'll leave with one last question that just feels pretty timely. So in 2016, we saw bad actors trying to influence America's elections through social media. How do you think AI may be used in 2024 to do the same?
I think that's the million-dollar question that we're all a bit nervous about right now as we head into this. And 2024, the US election is highly visible, but it's not the only one. And there are, very important elections in a variety of parts of the globe. I think, those bad actors are going to probably continue to do what they were doing last time round. They never stopped. It's not like those actions, they just down tools after 2016 or after 2020. They've been active the whole time. In fact, Meta just put out they issue a quarterly threat report, and Russia, China, Iran, all continuing to operate, all continuing to ramp up operations that are being uncovered. And there was one particular operation that had more than 4,000, I think it's close to 5,000 accounts that Meta had taken down and discovered and taken down as part of their work. So I think what we're the idea of like falsehoods being sown to the questioner's point has been around for 7, 8, well, more than this. Like misinformation, disinformation, let's be clear, it's been around for 50 plus years. This is about new tactics and new techniques being used within it. So I do think we're going to, the scary part here is that I think we are likely to start to see more fake videos, more manipulated images, more things like that they're going to keep experimenting with. They're going to find, keep looking for new ways to spread them. And we saw that, I think, the most recent example of how that can manifest is what we saw around what's happening in the Middle East. Massive volumes of inauthentic conversation. Many people very legitimately concerned from a variety of angles about what's happening there, but also massive volumes of accounts that in the range of tens of thousands of accounts that just flipped on when October 7th happened and started posting at scale. We've seen manipulated images coming out of there, things that upon close inspection are AI generated but seem to be horrific. And then again, We talked about MDM and the malinformation earlier. That idea of images being used out of context. We see things there that are videos and images from other conflicts and other wars that are being purportedly related to this. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that. And the challenging part, I think the scary part is, what if we see something happen that's very close to election day that creates a significant groundswell and doesn't necessarily need to shape someone's opinion. Right? It doesn't need to make them go, oh, I support one candidate over another candidate because of this. All it needs to make them do is stay home and do nothing. And that's the threat. So not the happiest sentiment to end on here, but I think it's something that a lot of organizations, companies, and states alike are very concerned about.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Dave. I know we're over. We've received so many questions, so hopefully we can follow up with some of the folks that maybe didn't get some of theirs answered. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.